The rain had been falling on the moors for 3 days when Prudence Ashcombe first heard the horse. She heard it the way she heard everything in that cottage, through the walls which were thin, and through the roof, which leaked in 2 places she had learned to move the buckets under, and through the boy sleeping curled against her side beneath a wool blanket the color of nothing in particular. The horse was coming at a canter, which was foolish on a road that had turned to grease, and it was coming alone, which meant either a messenger or a man in trouble. She had lived long enough on this stretch of the North Road to know that both meant the same thing before the night was over. Someone would be knocking, and someone would be asking her to give up what warmth she had. She did not move at once. She lay listening, her broad arm curved over the child, feeling the small rise and fall of his breathing against her ribs, and she counted. She had learned to count in bad moments. It was a trick her father had taught her before the drink took the last of him, and she had kept it the way a woman keeps a ring after the man who gave it is gone. 1, 2, 3. The horse slowed. 4, 5, 6, 7. And boots came down into the mud. 8. And someone was walking around the cottage, testing the shutters. 9. And the knock came, hard and civil. She rose then, and she rose the way a large woman rises in a small bed with a sleeping child. Carefully, in stages, with the practiced grace of a body that has been remarked upon since girlhood and long since stopped listening. She was a big woman. She had been a big woman at 14, and she was a big woman now at 28, and she had heard every word for it that the county had to offer. Her sisters had used them like small stones. Her stepmother had used them like a broom. The village boys had used them like a joke that never got old, until she had stopped hearing the joke and started hearing only the boys, and had pitied them for having so little else. She wore a plain gray wool that had been dyed twice, and a shawl the color of tea, and her hair was pinned up with 3 pins that had belonged to her mother, and she did not look at herself in the small square of mirror by the door as she passed it. She had not looked at herself in a mirror in some months. There had not been time. The knock came again. "A moment," she said, and her voice did not shake, though the cold flagstones bit through her stockings, and her heart was doing an unlovely thing behind her sternum. She lit the tallow stub in the sconce, and she opened the door on its chain, and she looked out into the wet dark at a man she had never seen before, whose greatcoat had been cut by a London tailor, and whose eyes she could not read at all. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said. It was not a question. "Miss," she said, because she was particular about it, and because the correction cost her nothing. He inclined his head 1/8 of an inch, as if noting the point for a ledger somewhere. "Miss Ashcombe, I have ridden from Harrowmere. I have reason to believe that a boy is in your keeping. I have reason to believe that he is mine." Behind her, the child made a small sound in his sleep, and Prudence's hand rose without her permission and settled flat against the door. As if to hold the whole cottage shut, she looked at the stranger for a long moment. He was tall, and his face was the kind that a portrait painter would have loved and a wife might not. Bones, very fine, mouth held in the disciplined line of a man who has stopped expecting to be pleased by anything he sees. He was drenched. He did not seem to know it. His gloves were ruined. He did not seem to know that either. What she saw, and what surprised her, was that he was watching her hand where it lay against the door, and his own hand, hanging at his side, had moved as if he had almost reached to steady her before remembering himself. She did not open the chain. "You have the wrong cottage," she said. "I have not. You have the wrong woman." "I have not," he said again more quietly, and something in the quietness of it went into her like a splinter. "Miss Ashcombe, I have been looking for that child for 4 years. If you have him, and I do not ask you yet how, then I am asking you now, for God's sake, to let me see his face." Now, before we go further into that night, and before the door with the chain on it opens or does not open, you must understand something. Prudence Ashcombe had not stolen a child. She had been given one. She had been given him in a stable yard by a woman half dead of fever, who had pressed a bundle into her arms and said only please, and been carried away in a cart, and never come again. That had been 4 winters ago, when Prudence had been a governess in a household outside Kingston, and had been dismissed the following week without a reference, on a charge she had never been permitted to answer. She had come home, and there was no home, because her father had died, and her stepmother had taken the cottage and the little money, and so she had walked further north, with a child on her hip, who called her nothing, at first, and then began, in his own time. She had raised him on mending and on nursing and on the small kindnesses of a village that did not much care where a child came from as long as he was quiet in church. His name, she had been told by the fever woman in the stable yard, was Thomas. She had not changed it. She had thought, whoever wanted him, and did not come, at least should be able to find him by his name. She had not, in 4 years, expected anyone to come at all. She looked now at the stranger on her step, and she measured him against the fever woman's whispered please, and she measured him against a sleeping weight against her ribs, and she said, "Sir, I do not know you, and I will not open my door to a man in the middle of the night without a name." "Sebastian Harrowmere," he said, "Duke of Harrowmere, and I am not asking you to open the door yet. I am asking you to look at me while I say this." And the child was taken from the nursery in the spring of the year 7. He was 3 years old. His mother had died the winter before. The woman who took him was a nursery maid I had trusted for 6 years. Her name was Alice Beale. She was seen last outside Kingston, running a fever, and there she disappeared. I have followed her since. I have followed her by every road she might have taken. 2 weeks ago, a man in a village called Fen Ridge told me a woman had died in a stable there, of the fever, in the year of my son's disappearance, and had left a bundle with a young governess passing through. That governess was you. She stood very still. The rain was coming through the door frame in a fine mist, and settling on the hair at her temples. "His name," she said finally, because it was the only test she had left, "is Thomas." The Duke of Harrowmere closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them she saw briefly what he had been holding behind them for 4 years, and it was not the face of a duke. "His name is Thomas," he said, "for his grandfather." "Please." She undid the chain. He did not rush in. He was, she noticed, careful, with his boots on her flagstones, with his shoulder in her doorway, with the small distance he kept between his greatcoat and her furniture. He was a large man, and he moved like a man used to breaking things by accident. He stopped in the middle of her one room, and he saw the bed, and he saw the child, and he did not go to him. He looked at her instead. "May I?" he said. "You may look," she said. "Do not wake him. If you wake him, I will put you back in the rain." She did not mean it as a threat. She meant it as a fact, and he heard it as one. And he inclined his head that same 1/8 of an inch and went quietly to the edge of the bed. He knelt. He was not a man who knelt often, she thought. She watched the greatcoat bunch about him, watched the mud on his knees, watched the long, careful hand lift and stop and lift again and settle at last on the very edge of the blanket. Not on the child. He turned back the wool. An inch. Only an inch. Only enough to see the small round face against the pillow, the dark hair damp from sleep, the mouth open in the perfect defenseless way of a child of 7 who has been fed and warmed and told he is loved. The Duke of Harrowmere put his other hand over his mouth. He knelt there for what Prudence would afterwards remember as a very long time. And he did not weep, But she saw the shoulders of the greatcoat shake once, in the way of a man who has learned not to weep and is being tested. When he finally rose, he did not look at her. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, and he said, in a voice she had to strain to hear, "That is my son." "I know," she said, because in the moment he knelt she had known too. "I am going to have to take him from you." "I know," she said again. "And here is the thing, child, that the storyteller must tell you plainly." She had known that also, from the moment she opened the chain. She had known it all 4 years, in some quiet room of herself, the way a woman knows that a rented cottage is not her own, no matter how she scrubs the hearth. She had known that Thomas would be claimed one day, and she had known it would break her, and she had not stopped scrubbing the hearth. Because you do not love a child less, because the loving of him will hurt you. You love him more, and you keep the ribbons neat, and you count. "But not tonight," said the Duke of Harrowmere. She looked at his back, at the wet greatcoat and the dark hair curling at his collar, and she said, "No, not tonight. He does not know me. No. He is afraid of strangers. All children are," she said, "who have been passed hand to hand once in their lives." "Yes, he is." The Duke turned then, and he looked at her fully for the first time in a lit room, and she felt his looking, and she did not lower her eyes. She had trained herself long ago not to lower her eyes for anyone. She saw him take her in. The plainness of the wool, the pinned-up hair, the size of her, the wide, steady set of her shoulders, the hands folded in front of her that were red at the knuckles from wringing out shirts in cold water. She saw him look, and she waited for the flicker she had seen on 100 faces, the small adjustment of the mouth as a man decided what she was, and shelved her. But the flicker did not come. What came instead was something more difficult to bear. He looked at her the way she had watched him look at Thomas, the way a man looks at a thing he has been searching for, without knowing. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I am going to ask it badly, because I have not slept properly in 4 years, and I have never in my life had to ask this of a woman. Will you come with him? I beg your pardon, to Harrowmere. Will you come with him? Not as a servant. I will not insult you, as the person who has been his mother in fact these 4 years, until he is ready, until he knows me, until he knows the house, until he knows he is safe. I do not know how long that will be. I will not put a term to it. I will pay whatever you name." "You cannot pay for that," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I am asking." She looked at him. She looked at the sleeping child. She looked briefly, and by no choice of her own, at the small square of mirror by the door, and did not know herself. "On terms," she said. "Name them, not tonight." "I will name them tomorrow. Tonight you will sit by that fire and dry yourself, sir, or your grace, whichever it is. A duke is called at 3 in the morning in a cottage that is not his, and you will not go near that child again until he wakes, and I have told him who you are in my own words. And you will not speak to me now, because if you speak to me now, I will say something I cannot take back, and I do not care to give a duke that satisfaction on our first acquaintance." He looked at her. And then, very slowly, the Duke of Harrowmere, who had ridden 3 days through rain, who had followed a fever ghost across half of England, who had knelt at the edge of a stranger's bed and found his son, sat down on the low stool by her hearth, and he put his hands to the fire. She stood at the window a long time herself watching the rain, and she counted. She got as far as 70 before she stopped, and let herself for the first time that night be afraid. In the morning she woke Thomas the way she always woke him, with her hand on his hair and a hum in her chest, and she said, "There is a gentleman here who has come a long way to see you, and I would like you to sit up and be brave for me." Said. He sat up. He was a serious child. He had been a serious child from the day the fever woman had put him in her arms, and Prudence had never tried to make him otherwise. She had thought his gravity was his mother's last gift to him, and she had kept it whole. He looked at the Duke, sitting at the hearth. The Duke looked at him. "Good morning," said the Duke. "Good morning, sir," said Thomas. "My name is Sebastian. My name is Thomas." "I know," said the Duke, and his voice went very briefly, out of true, and Prudence looked away and busied herself with the kettle, because a child ought to be permitted to meet his father without being watched. That was the first morning. The second morning was the naming of terms, and Prudence named them at the small table with the kettle between them, and the Duke sat across from her with his hands folded like a man in court. She had, the night, thought about what she would say, and she had cut her list down to what mattered. Firstly, she said, "You will not tell him I am not his mother until he asks. When he asks, we will tell him together, and we will tell him the truth. All of it. In words a boy of 7 can hold. I will not have him fed a story and then find out later he was told a lie for his own comfort. He has had enough of being handled. Agreed? Secondly, the woman who took him. Alice Beale. Whatever she did or did not do, she is dead, and I am the one who fed him, and I am the one who sat up with him when he had the croup, and I will not have her spoken of in his hearing as a criminal. Not yet. Not until he is old enough to weigh it. He will not carry that as a child." The Duke was quiet a long moment. "Agreed. Thirdly, I am not a governess. I am not a nurse. I am not a poor woman being given charity by a great house. If I come with him, I come as what I have been, his people. If your household cannot bear that, we do not come." The Duke looked at her across the kettle. "My household," he said, "will bear what I tell it to bear." "That is not the same thing, sir." He almost smiled. It was the first almost smile she had seen on him, and it did something to his face that she filed away without permission and did not intend to think about. "No, it is not. Bull. I take the correction. My household will learn to bear it, then, and I will help them." Fourthly, she hesitated. She looked at Thomas, who had taken a wooden horse to the doorstep and was riding it up and down the flagstones with grave concentration. "There is one thing I must ask you. I have to ask it now, before we go anywhere, because if the answer is wrong, I will not go." "Ask." "Who took him?" He looked at her a moment. "Alice Beale." "No," she said. "You said you had trusted her 6 years. A woman who has been trusted 6 years does not, alone, take a duke's son." "Not without help?" "Not without a reason," someone put in her mouth. "Who took him, sir?" "All of it. I do not bargain with half a story." The Duke of Harrowmere was silent for a long time, and Prudence had the sense of watching a man decide whether to open a door that had been locked because opening it had cost him too much the first time. Then he said, "My brother. Hunmorm. Hasseber." She waited. "My younger brother, Julian. He was the heir, before Thomas was born. When my wife died and Thomas was small, and I was, I suppose, not what I ought to have been to either of them for a year, my brother made a case quietly to certain people that the child was not mine, and Blay, that my wife had, that Thomas was not a Harrowmere. It was a lie. I never doubted it was a lie. But it was a well-made lie, and it had begun to sit in rooms and I was too grief-stupid to see it. And then the boy vanished. And with the boy, vanished. My brother became my heir again, in fact. And shortly after, because a man cannot let a rumor like that die on its own. The case that Thomas had not been mine became the case that Thomas had never truly existed, as my son at all, only as my wife's mistake. And there were papers. Miss Ashcombe. There were papers. My brother produced letters. Letters purporting to be, from my wife to another man. Letters that any expert would tell you now were forged, and I told them so at the time, and it did not matter because I could not produce the boy. So you have been, she said carefully, not only searching for your son. You have been searching for the proof that your wife did not betray you. Yes, said the Duke. His hands on the table were very still. Yes. I have been searching for both. And your brother is at Harrowmere now. My brother is at Harrowmere now. He is what people call, in society, indispensable. He runs the estate in my absences. He is very charming. He is very patient. He has been waiting 4 years for me to give up. And when we come, said the Duke. And now, she saw the look on him that she would later come to know as his working look. The look of a man who has been noticing things for a very long time, and is at last going to be permitted to act on what he noticed. When we come, Miss Ashcombe, my brother will meet a boy with my father's mouth and my mother's eyes, and he will know within an hour that his 4 years of careful architecture are finished. And I will need, in the days after that, a person in that house who cannot be flattered, cannot be frightened, and cannot be bought. I am none of those 3, said Prudence. Not because I am virtuous, because I am poor, and I have been shouted at by better women than any duchess, and I have not the vanity for flattery. It has been trained out of me. I gathered, said the Duke of Harrowmere, and the almost smile came back, and this time it did stay. They left 3 days later, in a carriage he had sent for from the nearest posting inn, and Prudence sat in it with Thomas on her lap, and looked out at the moor she had lived on for 4 years, and did not weep. She had done her weeping the night before, alone, into a folded apron, in the manner of a woman who has been given a joy so large that it must be paid for in salt. She was going into a house she did not know, at the sight of a man she did not know, at the invitation of a rank she had been trained to curtsy to from a distance. She had 1 trunk. In it was a wooden horse, 3 books, her mother's pins, and a folded piece of paper, on which in the stable yard 4 winters ago, she had written down every word the dying woman had said to her. She had never known if it would be needed, and she had kept it, because Thomas's mother had kept nothing else to give him. And the words of the woman who carried him out of that house, even if that woman had been used, even if she had been paid, even if she had been lied to, were part of what he was. Harrowmere rose from its park like a thing carved out of the same pale stone as the sky. She had prepared herself for grandness. She had not prepared herself for cold. The hall they crossed was the size of her old chapel and echoed like one. And every servant in it wore the same expression, which was the expression of people who had been told, quietly, by someone else, to be wary. The Duke walked beside her without hurrying, and when she faltered once at the foot of the great stairs, because the stairs seemed suddenly like a thing built to remind a woman of her size, he did not offer her his arm, which she would have refused, but he slowed his own pace to hers by a fraction that only she noticed, and she kept climbing. Julian Harrowmere was waiting at the top. He was, she saw at once, the more beautiful of the 2 brothers. He was fair where Sebastian was dark. He was easy where Sebastian was contained. His smile was already arranged before they reached him, and he wore it, with the practiced grace of a man who had learned early that his face would forgive him things his conduct would not. "Brother," he said, "you have brought company, and a child. How singular!" He looked at Thomas, and his smile did not shift by a hair. And Prudence, who had watched cruel faces her whole life, saw underneath it the exact instant that Julian Harrowmere recognized his nephew and understood that he was at that moment ruined. He recovered beautifully. She had to give him that. The recovery was so smooth that if she had not been looking for it, she might have missed it altogether. "And Miss Ashcombe," said Sebastian. "Miss Prudence Ashcombe," said Sebastian. She is here at my particular request. She will be treated as a guest of this house." "Of course," said Julian. His eyes moved over her, and did the thing she had waited for on the Duke's face, and not found. The small adjustment of the mouth, the tiny recalibration. Julian Harrowmere had shelved her within a second and a half of meeting her, and the shelf he had chosen was low. She saw him think it. She saw him decide she was harmless. Well, she thought. Good. "Miss Ashcombe," said Julian, bowing without quite bowing. "You must be tired from your journey. I shall have Mrs. Pole show you to a room. She will be shown to the Rose apartments," said Sebastian. There was a small silence. The Rose apartments, Prudence would learn later, had been the Duchess's. They had been closed for 4 years. "Of course," said Julian, with only the slightest tightness at the corner of his mouth. "The Rose apartments. How thoughtful of you, brother." The Rose apartments smelled of dust and something else, the ghost of a scent, lavender maybe, that had been someone else's choice. Prudence walked through them slowly, with Thomas's hand in hers, and she did not touch anything. There was a portrait over the mantel of a slender woman with gray eyes and a serious mouth, and Thomas stopped in front of it and looked up. "Who is that?" he said. "That," said Prudence, "is a lady of this house." He looked at the portrait a long time. Then he said, "She has my eyes." Prudence knelt beside him carefully, in stages, as she rose from beds, because her body did what it did, and she put her arm around him. "Yes, my love, she does." Was she my mother? Prudence was quiet a moment. She had promised the Duke, and she had promised herself, that when Thomas asked, it would be told the truth, all of it, in words a boy of 7 could hold. She had thought she would have longer than an hour. Yes, she said she was. Her name was Cecily. She was a kind woman, and she loved you very much, and she has been gone a long time. Longer than you can remember. And you are not my mother, no, my love, but you were. She looked at him. He was looking at the portrait, still, and his small hand had closed around 2 of her fingers. "Yes," she said. "In every way I could be. I was, and, well." "Then," said Thomas, with the terrible seriousness of a child who has just decided a thing, "I have 2, one who is gone, and one who is here." "Yes, my love," said Prudence, and she did not weep in front of him, because that had not been part of the bargain she had made with herself. But she held him for a long time in front of that portrait, and she felt him accept a large and complicated fact about his life, with the calm of a boy who had already known in some quiet room of himself that his story was not simple. Behind her in the doorway, the Duke of Harrowmere had stopped and was standing very still. And she did not turn to see him, because she knew that if she turned, she would see a face that ought not to be looked at just then by a stranger. And she was still, she reminded herself, a stranger in that house. The first week at Harrowmere was the cold house. There is no other name for it. The servants did not know what to make of her, and so they made nothing of her. They were polite, and they were careful, and they moved around her the way water moves, around a stone in a stream, changing course without acknowledging why. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pole, was a stout woman, with a hard mouth, and eyes that did not miss much, and Prudence spent 3 days feeling herself measured by her before she was, on the 4th day, spoken to for the first time in her own voice. "You've had that boy on porridge and bacon," said Mrs. Pole, coming into the nursery in the middle of the morning. "It's why he doesn't want the fancy things cook's been sending up. He is used to plain food," said Prudence. "He is used to your food." "Yes." Mrs. Pole looked at her a moment. "I was here," she said, "when he was born. I dressed him for his christening. I laid out the little coat with the silver hooks." When he was taken, I—" She stopped. She set her jaw. "I was accused, Miss Ashcombe, along with 2 of the other maids. Only Alice was ever proved to have been near. But the accusation it was in the air, for a year longer. Some of the older staff—" "They never quite— Who accused you?" said Prudence, though she thought she already knew. Mrs. Pole did not answer at once. Then she said, "The gentleman who runs the house when his grace is away." "Ah," said Prudence. "That boy," said Mrs. Pole. "That boy in there. He looks at me the way she used to his mother. She was decent to us, Miss Ashcombe. And I've not been able to say her name in this house in 4 years, without someone finding a reason to change the subject. I do not know who you are, and I do not know how you came by him, and I do not need to know today. But I will tell you this: if you are what you look like to me, which is a woman who has fed a child other people threw away, then you will find that this house has more friends in it than you think, and fewer enemies than they'd like you to believe." She left. She did not look back. Prudence sat down on the edge of the nursery bed and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes for a moment, only a moment. And then she got up and went to see about Thomas's boots. Julian was charming. He was charming to her over breakfast, and charming to her in the long gallery, and charming to her in the library, where he found her one afternoon with one of the estate ledgers open on her lap because Sebastian had asked her quietly, the night before, whether she had any head for accounts. And she had said that her father had been a solicitor before the drink took him, and had taught her before she was 10 how to read a column of figures like a piece of music, and Sebastian had said, in a voice she was learning was his voice, for things that mattered, Miss Ashcombe. "Would you look at the household books for me? Not the estate books, the household books. Mrs. Pole's Julian keeps them for her. As a courtesy." She had understood what he was asking. Julian found her with the book open on the 3rd afternoon, and he laughed, easily, and said, "My dear Miss Ashcombe, whatever are you doing with that dreadful thing? It is enough to give a woman a headache." "I have a great tolerance for headaches," she said. He looked at her, still smiling, and she saw the smile hold, and she saw the eyes not hold. "It is only," he said, "that the household accounts are so tedious. Sebastian never bothered with them. Neither did poor Cecily. I have kept them up as a favor to Mrs. Pole for years, and I promise you there is nothing in them but wine and candles and the occasional carriage horse." "And a great many carriage horses, sir," said Prudence, without looking up. "For a house that keeps only 4. The room went quiet. Julian's smile did not slip. He was too well trained for that. But there was, for 1 second, a flat instant behind his eyes, the flat instant of a man realizing that the fat woman on the shelf was not, in fact, on the shelf. "You must forgive me, Miss Ashcombe," he said, and his voice was as light as it had been. "I have never had a head for figures. If there are errors, they are mine. And I shall look at them with you tomorrow." "Tomorrow would suit me," said Prudence, and went on down the column. She and Sebastian did not speak of it that night at dinner, because Julian was there, and because Thomas was there. Thomas was permitted at dinner, in a small clean coat, with silver buttons, and he sat next to Prudence, and used his knife the way she had taught him, and did not say much, but afterwards, when Thomas had been carried up to bed, and Julian had made his elegant excuses, and gone to the village on some errand that Prudence privately thought was less an errand than a walk. To steady his nerves, Sebastian found her in the library, and stood a moment in the doorway, and then came in and closed the door behind him. "How much?" he said. 1,500, said Prudence. "That I can see so far. Skimmed across 4 years, in small sums, hidden in the carriage horses and the wine cellar, and one very inventive line item called Garden statuary. I have been to the garden, sir. There is one statue. It is a Diana. She is missing an arm. 1,500, he said. That I can see, said Prudence. I have not begun on the estate books yet. He was clever enough not to touch those directly. But there are 3 tenants whose rents are noted as unpaid in the estate ledger and paid in the household. 1. And I would like to write to those 3 tenants tomorrow. Sebastian sat down in the chair opposite her. He did not sit like a duke. He sat like a man who had been standing for 4 years. Miss Ashcombe, he said. Yes. You have been here 5 days. Yes. How? She looked at him. The library was warm. A fire had been lit at her request, because she had said she read better with one, and no one had denied her. She had eaten well that day, and she had a shawl about her shoulders that had been produced without comment from somewhere in the linen room. And she realized with a small internal shock, warm, a room that had a fire, in a house that had begun in some room of itself to open the shutters for her. Why? Because he does not see me, she said. Sir, your grace. Whichever. Your brother does not see me. He has looked at me perhaps 10 times since I came to this house, and each time he has looked at what he expects to see, which is a large woman of no consequence, who has attached herself to his brother's regained child. He does not think me a threat because he does not think me a person. This is not a complaint, it is the reason I can read his books and he cannot stop me. Men like him are slow, sir, and men who have grown used to being the cleverest man in a room are slowest of all. And grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. He thought your grief had made a fool of you. Now he thinks the fat governess is amusing herself with the ledgers. In 3 days he will begin to correct that. But by then I hope to have his letters. His letters. Yes, the forgeries. The ones purporting to be from the Duchess. He will not have destroyed them. A man who forged papers well enough to survive 4 years' scrutiny will have kept the drafts, sir. He will have wanted to admire them. Where? In his rooms. Somewhere he can lock and no one else does. Not the study is. The study is public, his dressing room perhaps, or a cabinet in his bedchamber. I do not intend to go looking, your grace. That is not my part. My part is to prove the theft in the household books so that you have grounds, plain and legal, to have his rooms searched by your solicitor with witnesses, and then when the letters are found the theft and the forgery come to court together, and there is no story he can tell that fits both. Sebastian looked at her a long moment across the fire. Prudence Ashcombe, he said, where, in God's name, have you been for 28 years? On a moor, she said, raising your son. He did not answer that. He looked into the fire instead, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and she felt it was the strangest thing to feel. In a duke's library, in a stolen shawl, with 1,500 pounds of thievery neatly totaled on a page in her lap, she felt that she had, without meaning to, come home. He noticed her. In those weeks. That was the thing. Prudence had spent her life not being noticed, and now she lived in a house with a man whose way of loving anything was to notice it. And it undid her more slowly and more completely than she was equipped to bear. He noticed that she took her tea very hot and very strong. A fresh pot began to appear at her elbow in the library at 4 o'clock without her asking. He noticed that she flinched minutely at the servant's bell, because at her stepmother's it had been used to summon her at all hours. The bell to her wing was, without announcement, disconnected. He noticed that she rose from low chairs with difficulty, because her knees had been through 28 years of being a large woman on hard floors. The low chair by the fire vanished one afternoon, and a taller one, well cushioned and broad in the seat, took its place, and no one said a word. He noticed the tired maid on the back stairs and asked after her mother. He noticed the boy in the stable yard, who did not laugh at his own joke. He noticed her, she noticed him back. And she noticed the way his voice softened for Thomas and did not for anyone else. She noticed that he had begun, after the first fortnight, to come to the nursery in the evenings, and sit on the low chair Thomas had claimed, and listen, while Thomas read aloud, badly and with great concentration, a pat. From a book about horses, she noticed that he did not touch the child, unless the child touched him first, and that he watched Thomas the way a man watches a candle he has been asked to carry across a windy yard. She noticed that when he looked at her he did not, as Julian did, look through her, and she noticed that when he looked at her, he sometimes briefly looked away, and she did not know at first what that looking away meant. And then one evening, coming out of the nursery with her sleeves rolled up because Thomas had spilled his milk, she caught him in the doorway looking at her forearms, plain, round, freckled from the moor sun. And she saw that he had looked away, not because he was displeased, but because he had not meant to be caught looking, and she went into her rooms and sat down on the edge of the bed with a hand pressed flat against her sternum. "Oh no! Oh no! Prudence Ashcombe, you fool!" She had been a fool for less than a week when Julian moved. It was clumsier than she had expected, which was, she reflected afterwards, the tell of a frightened man. She had gone into the village on a Wednesday morning to see the vicar, because Mrs. Paul had told her the vicar's wife had known Cecily Harrowmere in girlhood, and had things she might wish to say to the woman raising Cecily's son. Prudence had walked in. She preferred to walk when she could, because carriages did not suit her, and she had spent an hour with the vicar's wife, who had said many things and had wept once, and had given Prudence a small silver locket that had a lock of Cecily's hair in it. "My dear," and Prudence had said she would. And then, coming out of the vicarage into a bright cold noon, she had been approached in the lane by a woman she did not know, in a plain traveling cloak, who had said her name in a low voice and had said, "Miss Ashcombe, I was Alice Beale's sister. Alice did not die. Alice is alive and she is in Portsmouth, and she has said things you will wish to hear." Prudence stopped in the lane. She looked at the woman. She saw at once, not Alice Beale's sister. She was a small, hard-mouthed woman of the type Prudence had spent her life being ignored by, and she had the studied nervousness of a person who has been coached in a lie by someone smoother than herself. The Duke had told her plainly that Alice Beale had died in the fever 4 winters ago. The Duke had followed her body to the pauper's grave and paid himself for the stone. "Who sent you?" said Prudence. The woman's mouth worked. "I am telling you, Miss Ashcombe, my sister who sent you," said Prudence again. "I have not much time, and I have less patience, and I have heard better lies than yours from women who did not want their laundry noticed. Who sent you?" The woman looked at her a moment, then she looked down. "A gentleman," she said at the end. "He gave me 2 guineas to tell you Alice was alive, and to say she wanted to see you. He said, if I told you that, and you came with me to Portsmouth, he would give me 2 more. When are you to bring me to Portsmouth tonight?" "On the mail." "Ah," said Prudence. She thought for a moment. She thought quickly, because she had, in a house of quiet noticing, been learning how to think quickly. She thought about Thomas, who was at that moment in the nursery with the second housemaid, and she thought about Sebastian, who was at that moment in his study going over the household accounts with her tenant's letters spread beside him, and she thought about Julian, who had at breakfast that morning said, easily, that he would be riding to Fenmore for the day, and would be back very late, and she understood, with a coldness that went from her scalp to her heels, that Julian had never gone to Fenmore, that Julian was somewhere very near this village at this moment, that Julian had chosen this Wednesday, because it was the Wednesday she had told Mrs. Pole at breakfast she would be walking to see the vicar's wife, and that Julian had decided, in whatever hour of the previous night his 4 years of architecture had finally cracked, that the simplest cure for the fat governess was for the fat governess to disappear. She looked at the small, hard-mouthed woman. Where is he now? Miss. Where the Hare and Bell? On the road out. He said to bring you there by 3. Then you shall bring me there by 3, said Prudence. She walked back to the vicarage. She went inside. She wrote a note on the vicar's paper with the vicar's pen, and she sealed it, and she said, Reverend, you will send this to Harrowmere in the hand of the fastest boy you have. He will put it in the Duke's own hand, and no one else's, not the butler's, not the housekeeper's his. And he will not stop for anything on the road. My dear Miss Ashcombe. Please. The vicar looked at her. He was a mild man who had spent his life avoiding decisions of consequence, and Prudence Ashcombe was not. That morning, a woman one avoided. At once, he said. She walked with the hard-mouthed woman to the Hare and Bell. She walked slowly because she wished to be seen walking, and she wished to be seen going in of her own will, because a woman who is later said to have been abducted is a woman with a case in a magistrate's court, and Prudence Ashcombe intended a case in a magistrate's court. She walked in the front door of the inn. The landlord looked up and she smiled at him plainly and without warmth, and said his name, because she had made a point of learning the names of the tradespeople in the village in her first fortnight. And she said, Mrs. Turner will not tell you my name, sir, but I am Miss Ashcombe of Harrowmere. And I am here to speak with the gentleman in a private parlor, and I would be obliged if you would remember, later, when you are asked, that I walked in through your door on my own 2 feet, and unarmed, and that this woman here was with me, and that you saw us both. The landlord's mouth opened. Yes, sir, said Prudence. Thank you. The parlor, please. He showed her to the parlor. Julian was standing at the window with his back to the door. He did not turn at once. When he did, it was with the smile still ready. And Prudence saw, this time, that the smile no longer quite fit. He had been arranging and rearranging it for an hour, and it had gone stiff. Miss Ashcombe, what a surprise! I doubt that, said Prudence. I am not sure sir, let us not. I am tired, and I have walked, and I would like to sit, if you will permit it, in your private parlor, because your private parlor is now the room in which you and I are going to speak plainly to each other for the first and last time. I have written to your brother. He will be here within the hour. Before he comes, I would like you to tell me what you meant to do with me in Portsmouth. He stared at her. Then he laughed. It was the shortest laugh she had ever heard. You have written to Sebastian. I have. You have said what? That his brother has hired a woman to tell me his old nursery maid is alive, and to bring me to Portsmouth on the mail, and that I am walking into the trap now because I would prefer to spring it under my own foot than have it sprung under your nephew's. Julian sat down. He had not meant to. His knees had gone. He sat down at the small parlor table and he looked at Prudence Ashcombe across it, and Prudence saw at last all the way through him, not to some hidden nobility, because there was none, but to the exhausted vanity underneath, the exhausted vanity of a man who had spent 4 years arranging papers and smiling at his brother and hating the child he had once expected to be, and had been briefly, and would never be again. You are not what I thought you were, he said. No, sir. You were meant to be. I know what I was meant to be, sir. I was meant to be a large woman of no consequence, who had attached herself to your brother's regained child. I have been that woman for other people my whole life. Your mistake was assuming I was that woman for myself. I am not, sir. I have never been. He looked at her. He looked at her a long time. And then, very slowly, he said, You will not be believed. You are a governess. You are. Forgive me. You are what you are. Sebastian will forgive you the accusation and send you back to the moor. My word against yours in a magistrate's court is £1,543 and 6pence, said Prudence. he stopped. Skimmed, she said, from the household accounts, sir, over 4 years. In sums small enough not to be noticed by a duke and large enough to be noticed by me. I have the entries copied out. I have the tenants' letters. I have Mrs. Pole's original books which do not agree with your copies. I have not troubled myself with the letters yet. The forgeries, I mean. Those are in your dressing room, are they not, sir? A cabinet. You will have kept them. Vanity is very consistent. Your brother's solicitor will find them by nightfall. And so, sir, it is not my word against yours, in a magistrate's court. It is a set of household ledgers, 3 tenants' letters, a set of forgeries in your own dressing room, and a small hard-mouthed woman named Mrs. Turner, who has already told me, in front of the landlord of the Hare and Bell, that you paid her 2 guineas to lure me to Portsmouth. My word does not need to enter it, sir. My word is decorative. Julian Harrowmere put his beautiful face in his beautiful hands. The door opened. Sebastian Harrowmere stood in it. He was not out of breath. He was too disciplined for that. But he had ridden hard, and his hair was wet at the temples, and he was looking not at Julian but at Prudence, first and only. And he crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped in front of her and took her hands in his hands and said, "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes, Prudence." He had not called her Prudence before he had called her Miss Ashcombe for 4 weeks and a Wednesday. "I am not hurt," she said. "I am here." He held her hands 1 moment longer. Then he let them go. And he turned and he looked at his brother across the small parlor table. And he said, quite quietly, "Julian, stand up." Julian stood up. "You will ride with me to Harrowmere," said Sebastian. "You will sit in my study while my solicitor is sent for. You will hand over the keys to your dressing room. You will not speak to any member of my household on the way. You will not, above all, speak to my son. If you attempt any of these things, I will have you taken up on the road by the constable, and it will be in every paper in England by Friday. Do you understand me? Sebastian? Do you understand me? Yes, good." He turned back to Prudence. He looked at her a moment. He said, "You will ride back with me in the carriage. You have walked enough today." She almost laughed. "Your Grace, Sebastian. Sebastian, I can walk." "I did not," he said, "say that you could not walk. I said you had walked enough today. Do me the courtesy, please, of allowing me to be, this once, of some small use to you." She looked at him. She had been looked at by many men in her life, most of them badly, some of them with contempt, none of them, until that moment, with what she saw in his face in the doorway of the Hare and Bell, which was not gratitude and was not pity and was not, thank God, admiration for a fat woman's cleverness. It was something plainer and worse. She had to look away from it. "Very well," she said. The rest of that afternoon and evening she remembered afterwards in fragments. The carriage ride back, with Julian on horseback beside a groom, and Sebastian on the seat opposite her, not speaking, watching her face. The arrival at Harrowmere in the long light. The solicitor sent for. The dressing room open. The letters in the cabinet exactly where she had said they would be. A small stack of drafts on the top, and a fair copy of the finished forgeries in a folder beneath. The ink of them still not quite matched to the paper, and the solicitor's face going white and then red as he read them and understood, all at once, 4 years of a family. Julian, in Sebastian's study, hearing what would be done with him, not ruin in the end, because Sebastian was not a man for public ruin, but a settlement, on a distant estate in the north, with the estate's steward answering to Sebastian directly, and never Harrowmere again in his lifetime, and never his name in a paper. Julian at the last, looking not at Sebastian, but at Prudence in the doorway, and saying, "Miss Ashcombe, congratulations." And Prudence, not looking at him at all, saying, "Sir, I do not accept them," that was in the study. The confession, which is what Prudence would afterwards think of it as, though he did not confess so much as simply, at last, stop hiding, was in the library, late, after Thomas had been put to bed with a story and a kiss on the forehead, and had said sleepily, "Prue, will you be here in the morning?" And she had said, "Yes, my love. I will be here in the morning." And he had said, "Good night, Mamma." And she had gone out of the nursery with her hand over her mouth, and Sebastian, who had been standing outside the door and had heard it, had said nothing, and had walked with her down the long corridor to the library, and had closed the door. He did not speak at once. He went to the fire. He stood at it. He turned. He said, "I have been a coward, Prudence." "You have not. I have. 4 years I have been a coward. I let my brother in the house, because he was easier than my grief. I let my wife's name go on being questioned, because to defend it I would have had to speak of her, and I could not. I let my son be gone, because at the bottom of my heart I did not believe I deserved to have him back. I have been searching. Yes, I have been searching for 4 years. But I have been searching. Prudence, the way a man searches for a thing he is not sure he has the right to find. And then I came to your door. And you opened it on a chain. And you would not let me near him, until you had my word. And you set your terms at your own table, and you told me my household would learn to bear you, and I—" He stopped. He looked into the fire a moment. "I have been noticing you, Prudence, since the moment you opened that chain. I did not know what to do with it. I thought it was gratitude. I thought it was. I told myself many things. It was not any of them. I have not looked at a woman since Cecily died. I did not think I would. She stood by the door. She did not sit. She did not trust her knees. Sebastian, she said, do not say it, if it is only gratitude. It is not gratitude. Do not say it if it is only that I gave you your son. You gave me my son, he said. And you gave me my wife's name back. And you gave me a house that has a fire in it. Any one of those, and I would owe you more than I can pay. All 3, and I would owe you my life. That is not what I am saying to you now.